Ready? Thank you for coming. Tonight's program is dedicated by the Morris, Ben-Zvi, and Pushit families in memory of Conrad Morris and Michael Pushit, and we thank these families for their ongoing support of the Women's Beit Midrash. It is my pleasure to introduce David Curwin, who is now a good friend of mine since moving to Efrat, and I always know that if I have a meal with David, it's going to be thought-provoking, stimulating, interesting, keep me on my toes the entire time. David currently works as a technical writer, but you might not know that because when you sit and talk with him, you think he must be a professor and academic. David is an independent scholar, and he basically researches everything, right? It's pretty much, everyone's nodding their heads, so they agree with me, David, okay? Bible, Jewish philosophy, Hebrew language, and his writings have appeared in periodicals such as Tradition and Chakira and Jewish Bible Quarterly. And if you want to find more of David's writings, you can go to his blog, balashon.com. So David lives in Azayat with his family, Toby in the back, shout out. And it is really our pleasure to launch David's first book that he wrote on Kohelet, A Map to Aden, and it's our pleasure. So David, take it away.
Request if those sitting in the back to please move up. We would love to have you join us from closer up. Thanks.
There are source sheets if anyone doesn't have it. Not critical, but they'll be helpful, I think, for a couple of things I'll end up quoting. Okay, so I'm gonna set the scene. Sukkot, 1990, Kibbutz Tirat Tzvi. Louder? Okay. Perfect.
Good reminder.
Good reminder. Okay. I'm setting the scene. Sukkot, 1990, Kibbutz Tirat Tzvi. During the reading of Kohelet, one of my first that I recall as a 18-year-old, I fell asleep, banged my head in the stender, and broke my glasses. That's when I first came to the painful realization that there's a problem with Kohelet. So, what makes Kohelet so difficult? Maybe if you got people can just shout out a word or two about what you find difficult about Kohelet. I mean, unless you love Kohelet and have no problems with it, which I'm not sure why you're here.
Contradicts itself.
What's that?
It contradicts itself.
Contradictory, right?
Too many speakers.
Too many speakers, okay?
Depressing.
Repetitive.
No story.
No story.
Kind of leaves you hanging until the last sentence.
Leaves you hanging, right? It's hard to find what the point is. Anything else? Yeah?
Seems to be unrelated to Torah mitzvot.
Exactly. Seems to be unrelated to Torah mitzvot. Okay. You guys pretty much got almost my entire list. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to go over a few different points, and then we'll address we'll address them throughout the talk. One, it's definitely confusing. Is there any order or structure to Kohelet? Sometimes it feels with Kohelet that it's like a bag of fortune cookies that you're pulling out each one, but not very optimistic fortune cookies. And then in that note, it is depressing. It can be depressing. Hopefully, maybe we'll come out with a different feeling at the end of talk tonight, but it definitely comes across as depressing. It has no story, as was mentioned, and that's certainly as compared to the other Megillot. Esther and Ruth definitely have stories, and even Shir Hashirim and Echa have like a narrative structure. The Shir Hashirim talks about the relationship between the lovers, and Echa refers to Yerushalayim as a lone woman, and it's in some sort of historical context. The verses seem to contradict each other, as was mentioned. I don't think anyone mentioned this, but it's certainly kind of boring, or at least tedious. You can be honest about that. I certainly, that year, found it to be that way. And then the last question, which is maybe the crux of all of this, is what is it doing in Tanakh? Why is it here? The biblical books in general seem to fit in line with the general theme of the Tanakh. You could say the role of Am Yisrael in the world, fulfilling God's mission. I mean, in a nutshell, with the books of Tanakh. And it's really not clear what the purpose of Kohelet is. Even questionable books. They're books when the Tanakh was codified, there were discussions about what books should be included, and even the books that also were debated, like Esther and Shir Hashirim, you can find a pretty decent explanation for why they belong in the Tanakh. Esther isn't just a story of political intrigue, but also a story of God behind the scenes. And Shir Hashirim isn't just a beautiful love song, but also an allegory for the love between God and Am Yisrael. But Kohelet just seems like a general philosophic work, not tethered to the Tanakh at all. It could have been written by Plato, or more likely a nihilistic or existential philosopher like Nietzsche or Camus. So why is it here in the Tanakh? I'm not saying it wouldn't be interesting, but why is it in one of the books we read? And these are all questions that bother me, and I know that they bothered you and certainly many people over the generations. So now let's get to the point of how I ended up writing a book about it. And for that purpose, we're going to jump a number of years forward to Sukkot, 2017, Ramat Beit Shemesh. I'm at my brother-in-law's house. I came home from shul. Once again, didn't get much out of Kohelet. Didn't break my glasses, but didn't get much out of Kohelet, waiting for it to be over. Probably reading something else. But when I came home, I said, okay, what am I doing here? How can it be that every year I read this book and there's nothing I can't get anything out of it? I don't understand how I've arrived at this point. There has to be something if it belongs in Tanakh, and I love reading Tanakh. What am I doing with Kohelet? But I wasn't looking for answers to all these questions that we discussed about the depressed and confusing. I wasn't trying to find a way to explain them away. I was just saying, what is going on with this text? And I didn't have my library, and I didn't have my commentaries. I just had the Megillah in front of me. So came home, and I just opened it, and I just started looking at it. And while I was doing that, I started noticing these weird connections to the opening 4 chapters of Sefer Bereshit. In the end, I found dozens of connections, and if you those who read the book or will read the book, you'll find lists of them. But I'm just going to give you a few tastes, and they're in the notes here, just a couple, but hopefully the quantity of them, if you read the book, will be even more convincing if you have issues with any individual source that I quoted. So, for example, one of the most classic ones here is sources number 1 and 2. In source number 1, it says, "Hakol haya min afar v'shav el afar," all come from dust and return to dust. And then in Bereshit, Perek Gimel Yutet, it says, "Ki afar ata v'afar tashuv." That seemed to be lifted from Bereshit, even without any special tools. I caught that right away. In source number 3, this was a source talking about one of these verses that seems very esoteric, hard to understand, the Kohelet, but it says, "Yesh echad ve'en sheni v'gam ben ve'ach ein lo." There's a son with no fellow, there's another, without any other one, no son or no brother. And that seemed to me, at the time at least, to speak about Adam Rishon, who had no brother, and now he has no son, Hevel, who was lost, because I found a lot of connections to Cain and Hevel as well. And it then says that despite all his labor, his eye will never be sated with riches. He's never satisfied. And this would also apply to Adam Rishon. After he was expelled from the garden, he had to live a life of hard work, and yet never felt like satisfied. So that also seemed to speak to Adam. And then just one more that I didn't quote here, but just a little one where it talks about in Kohelet, Perek Vav, Pasuk Vav, Veilu Chaya Elef Shanim, talks about a person who lived 1,000 years. That certainly seemed to speak to Adam Rishon, and many more. I couldn't even take notes at the time, but I came home, I started writing it down. But I wasn't sure what to do with it. However, I have been exposed to the interpretive method of intertextuality over the previous several years through the works of Rabbi David Foreman and his institute, Aleph Beta, seen many videos, and actually became kind of close to Rabbi Foreman and been to his classes and corresponded with him, and I was in a fellowship with him. So I was aware that there's something to it. For those who aren't familiar with intertextuality as a term, you're probably familiar with intertextuality in some work you've encountered. a very famous example is the parallels between Megillat Esther and the stories of Yosef and Sefer Bereshit. You catch both linguistic connections. There's all kinds of phrases that seem to be in the Megillah that are taken from Yosef. There's certainly thematic connections about a Jew in the palace. So why was that there? Intentionally, because the author of Megillat Esther wanted us, while they were reading the story of Esther, wants us also to think about the story of Yosef. Both those things can coexist. And many other such connections between different works in the Tanakh. So that gave me the indication that the connections between Kohelet and Bereshit that I had found, these linguistic connections, were less and less likely to be coincidental. But what did all that mean? If there's not a coincidence, and the author of Kohelet was intending for the reader to pick up, to sense, to be thinking about Bereshit when he reads Kohelet, why? So the first thing I had to think about was who wrote Kohelet. The content of Kohelet, in my opinion, not only my opinion, certainly points to Shlomo HaMelech as being the author of Kohelet. The book opens by stating that it's Kohelet, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, and later it says, I, Kohelet, was king of Israel in Jerusalem, and the only son of David to become king was Shlomo, and he was the only Davidic king to rule over all of Israel. That's a kind of a technical thing, maybe you can argue that away. But more importantly, Kohelet describes a wise king, wealthy, with many wives, who built extensively. That's not just a coincidence, that's essential to this personality in Kohelet, and it's essential to Shlomo as well. And so it certainly fits Kohelet to a T. Now I have to acknowledge something, maybe the elephant in the room for those who are concerned about it. As I mentioned, I write a lot about language. In my blog, I've been writing for many years about the origins of Hebrew words and where they fit into the spectrum of Hebrew language from early biblical times until now. And admittedly, Kohelet uses late biblical language. It has borrowings from Aramaic and Persian, and in some ways it uses phrases that are much more close to Rabbinic Hebrew that came later. But I don't think that needs to disqualify the attribution to Shlomo. So first of all, within a religious perspective, I can note that Chazal say that Chizkiyahu wrote Kohelet, even though in other places they mention that Shlomo was the author. They say Chizkiyahu was the one who wrote Kohelet, which obviously much later. In other words, Chazal did not have a problem saying it wasn't Shlomo who actually penned the work of Kohelet. And in a vote to Rabbi Natan, it says the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the men of the Second Temple, were involved in its editing. The exact understanding of what that midrash means is not clear, but they were also involved in it. And I don't think that it's a problem saying that these might have been words originally associated with Shlomo and later written down in a different language, or for those who prefer, for whatever reasons, want to say that a later author was writing it and then said it was Shlomo. This is not really, doesn't really interest me, but what I can say is that when you read Kohelet, I strongly believe that you are intended to associate it with Shlomo. That's what the author intends. And I think we need to be wary of what's known as, in my, I would say my line of work, but my line of work is technical writing, in my hobby, of what's called the etymological fallacy. In the etymological fallacy, we conflate origin with meaning. It's kind of, if you ever have someone who says to you, don't use that word because that's not what it means now. Well, that doesn't really matter, because what it means now is how we use it now. And what its origin is interesting, it's fascinating to me, but it's not what it means now. And so the historical development of Kohelet is of interest, but it's not what I'm focusing on when I'm reading the book. That's how I read it. Now you might be asking, why not just use Shlomo's name in the book? Wouldn't that have been simpler? The other books attributed to him in the Tanakh, Shir Shirim and Mishlei, include his name. So, as we'll get to, I think that in this book, unlike those other books, reflect Shlomo's failure. It's shameful. So by not using his name, it kind of hides his shame. And there's precedent for that by another late biblical book, Divrei Yamim. Divrei Yamim does not mention any of Shlomo's sins. So I don't know if the author of Divrei Yamim wasn't aware that Shlomo sinned, but there's a reason to preserve the dignity of Beit David and Shlomo's heritage, because that's where future kings are going to come from. And so that doesn't bother me. There's a reason. In the book, at the end, I give my own theories of why the name Kohelet was chosen. It's a little different than some of the other theories. I don't know if I'll get to it tonight, but I think that might be why Shlomo's not mentioned. Okay. So we want to say that Shlomo is the attributed author of Kohelet. Why would Shlomo choose to echo the language of Adam Rishon? So I think in many ways their lives are very similar. They both had uniquely universal scope. Adam, as the first human, represents all of humanity. And Shlomo, through his reputation, was the first Israelite to become universally known. They also both had incredible potential and a close relationship with God, and a special connection to God's place. Adam in Gan Eden and Shlomo in the Mikdash. In some ways, I think it's unparalleled in the Tanakh of finding any two individuals who had that kind of relationship with God. Even Moshe didn't enter the land. He didn't have that. He was obviously very close to God, but that special relationship and the special potential from the very beginning, and of course, their downfall was also in common, and both their downfalls were associated with a search for knowledge. And a search for knowledge along with an exile from that special place. So Adam ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which led to his expulsion from the garden. And Shlomo was very wise, but he complains in Kohelet about how that wisdom was pointless. He was a very wise judge, but according to the Gemara, he was so wise that he decided on his own whether the laws of the Torah applied to him. He first ignored the restrictions on wise horses and wealth, and in the end was caught up in idolatry. So the search for knowledge was part of that. I go into the book why. I can't go into the details here, but that search for knowledge was eventually led him to his downfall. And they also both had tremendous division and strife in the generation to follow them. Adam had Cain and Hevel, and Shlomo had Rechavam and Yerovam. So the main themes of Kohelet apply to both Adam and Shlomo. Let's just look at a few of the main themes. I counted like 4 main themes in Kohelet. Much of what we do in life is futile. Search for knowledge doesn't lead to a positive end. Death is inevitable. And the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper. Those are the 4 main themes in Kohelet. How do they apply to Adam and Shlomo? Well, much of what we do in life is futile. Adam works but can't rest, can't enjoy his labors. He's constantly having to work. That's his punishment. And Shlomo built the Mikdash, but he can't really enjoy it because he was ultimately involved in idolatry and in a large way expelled from that Mikdash. Searching for knowledge doesn't lead to a positive end. Adam's pursuit of tree of knowledge led to his punishment. And Shlomo, despite his wisdom, and maybe because of it, he led to failure, as we said. Death is inevitable. After the sin of Adam, death was introduced into the world. And Shlomo, as clearly it comes across in Kohelet, is very concerned about his legacy after his death. He did these incredible projects. What's left of all that? His kingdom certainly didn't remain after his death for very long, complete. And lastly, the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper. For Adam, we see it with Hevel. Hevel, the righteous Hevel, was killed, whereas Cain, his murderer, prospered at least for several generations to come. And Shlomo, it's a little more tricky, but if you look in Kohelet, you see some criticism of oppression. And I think he looks back at his reign, and he sees that people were oppressed. That's why they end up later rebelling. There's a number of reasons what happened to Shlomo, the issue of his punishment for his idolatry, but also the people complain about the oppression during his time, not only during his son's time. And if you look at Sefer Melachim, which I have a chapter of the book where I discussed this in the beginning in depth, in another example of intersexuality, you see a large number of connections between Shlomo and the Paro of Yetziat Mitzrayim. This is not coincidental either, and way that the Tanakh does it, kind of hinting, it makes you clear that if Shlomo is acting like Paro, there's something to be concerned about. One of the best examples of the parallelism between Kohelet and Bereshit is the repetition of the word Hevel. Anyone who's read Kohelet can't miss Hevel being repeated over and over and over again. Hevel is often translated as futility or vanity, but as we all know, it's also the name of Adam's son. So this word that appears 30 times in Kohelet, and the key word in Bereshit is, we see an example of what, that's a connection there. And so I think that Kohelet, Shlomo, is imagining, echoing, reflecting on what Adam would have thought at the death of Hevel. Adam, after searching for knowledge, eating from the tree of knowledge, was punished by God, and of all the punishments he received, the most dramatic of them was the introduction of death into the world. But who was the first human to die? It wasn't Adam, and it wasn't Chava. It was Hevel. So I think the repetition of this word in Kohelet is a type of mourning by Adam HaRishon. And I think this can help explain why the book is not written in a linear order that we might expect to find in other books of the Tanakh. If you go to the Shiva of an elderly relative, the mourners often tell over stories in a well thought out fashion. How the person was when they're younger and older, and it's, you go and hear the stories. It's something we're all accustomed to doing at a Shiva. But in a real tragedy, like a child, that's much less likely. And certainly, and this I've never experienced, but I can't imagine, but I can. If a parent felt guilty over the death of their child, as Adam might have done, because it was his fault that Hevel died, how would they possibly express that? They would be inconsolable. And so in Shlomo's mind, that's what Adam is just saying when he says Hevel, I call Hevel, 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 Hevel. He's expressing what Adam would have thought. This is a way, it's kind of like in a way like a midrash. Kohelet can be like kind of a midrash on Sefer Bereshit. It's filling in the gaps that we don't necessarily see in the text. We don't know how Adam felt about the events of Cain and Hevel. But by reading Kohelet, we can understand that a little better. So I did find some support for this idea in the Torah Tamimah's commentary on the Midrash Kohelet Rabbah, which says that Kohelet isn't in chronological order. That's the Midrash says. And the Torah Tamimah says that's because the book is an expression of the writer's feeling rather than a list of events that we might be expecting. So I don't think it's accurate to say that there's no plot to Kohelet. Kohelet reflects back on the stories of Adam and Shlomo. The plot isn't obvious, but it's there. Aside from, I mentioned, it's kind of like a midrash. We don't know a lot of things about Adam, besides the few 2 chapters or 3 chapters that we read about him, 2 chapters we read about him in Bereshit. We don't know what he thought about the punishments he received. We don't know what his life was like with Chava after the expulsion. Did he blame her? Did they reconcile? What was that like? That could have been easy. We don't know how the events of Cain and Hevel affected him. Was he angry at Cain? Did he mourn Hevel? We don't know any of this. He's silent. So Kohelet relates to those issues. But in addition to reflecting how Adam might have felt, it also reflects how Shlomo felt, because we don't know a lot about how Shlomo felt either. We know he had this desire for wisdom. He became a judge and a king. He built the Beit HaMikdash with all the political and social consequences, and he eventually was punished. And by the way, according to Chazal, he was even deposed as the king. But like Adam, we don't have his reaction all to his punishment. What did he regret? What would he have done differently? Did he rationalize it? Did he accept? Did he rationalize it like Shaul? Did he accept it like David? Did he? We don't have any information about this. And I think Kohelet is coming to fill in those gaps. So I think that the contradictory style that Chazal had a problem with is related to this. Chazal found that the contradictions in Kohelet were a reason to exclude Kohelet from the Tanakh. If you look at source 4, It says, "Bikshu chachamim lignoz sefer Kohelet mipnei shedvarim sotrim zeh et zeh." Within Kohelet, the verses contradict one another. Mipnei ma lo ginzu. Why do they not exclude it? Mipnei shetchilato divrei Torah v'sofo divrei Torah. There's words of Torah in the beginning and the end. Okay. Umay divrin sotrim zeh et zeh. Give me an example of what does it mean sotrim zeh et zeh. So it's in one place it says tov kas mischok, that anger is better than laughter. V'kativ lischok amarti mu'ulal, but I also said that laughter is praiseworthy. Another place it says v'shibachti ani et simcha, I praise simcha. V'kativ l'simcha mazo said. What's the point of joy? So they all, in addition to the internal contradictions, in source 5, in Vayikra Rabbah, they also found that it contradicts other parts of the Torah. So here's an example where they said, "Bikshu lignos sefer Kohelet shematzubo divim shenotim litzad minut." They were leaning towards heresy, meaning that they were contradicting the words of the rest of the Torah. So they give an example: Moshe Amar, "Lo tatu acharei Elohechem v'achareinechem." Don't follow your eyes and your heart and your eyes. Shlomo Amar in Kohelet, "Halach b'derchai libcha umarei einecha." Basically, follow your heart and your eyes. It's contradicting the Torah. But when we look at the book of Kohelet and we find these difficulties with it, I think we need to remember that Shlomo's choices and Adam's choices in lives were complicated. Some actions they had regret for, and some actions they might have had pride for, and it's mixed up. When we look back in our lives, it's not always so simple. Would another path really have served them better? Should Shlomo have not built the Beit HaMikdash because of the oppression that later encouraged while it was being built? It's not clear. So I think at times the Kohelet isn't being directly contradictory, but kind of ironic or cynical, as if to say, sure, build, enjoy life. It might seem fine at the time, but what is it really, where did it get me? There are a lot of different ways to read Kohelet, but I didn't find it that there were the verses directly contradicting one another in that sense. Sometimes you can say something's worth it, and sometimes you can say it's not, and that's just how life is. Life is complicated like that. An example of this is chapter 2, which I quote in source 6. Shlomo Kohelet boasts about his achievements. He says, there's a whole long list, you can read it inside, but he says, for example, Asiti li ganot upardesim v'natati be'emetz kol peri. I made gardens and orchards for myself and planted them with every kind of fruit tree. Right, that's exactly the point. He used creation language because at the time he thought his actions were going to be as successful as God's and as permanent as God's. And he did build a lot. But in the end, he felt that everything he did was pointless. As he says in the end, Paniti ani b'chol ma'asai shasu yadai ba'amal she'amalti lasot v'hinei akol hevel v'ruot ruach v'hinei torah mitachat hashemesh. There was no point in what I did. Is he really saying there was no point in what he did? I don't know. I mean, he did successfully build, but he looked back and said, look what happened. It wasn't really worth it in the bigger picture. I think that Chazal's notes here about the matchilim b'divrei Torah, m'sayim b'divrei Torah, goes back to the purpose of the intertextuality itself. This is something actually I only happened to think about in the past few days, but I'm so focused on intertextuality, but it was not really clear to me, okay, why? Why do we have this intertextuality? Why is that necessary? And besides the fact is, so there's a connection between the lives of Shlomo and Adam, and there's some advantages to it, but there's something bigger than that. By writing Kohelet in this way, by using language from Bereshit over and over again, we learn that Kohelet belongs as part of the larger corpus of Tanakh. It's not an isolated philosophical text. It's not a bag of fortune cookies. It's like we saw with Esther and Shir Hashim. It belongs in the Tanakh. And this is what they mean when they said they didn't exclude it because it includes Divrei Torah. Matchil b'Divrei Torah, Mesayim b'Divrei Torah. Rashi says, in that Gemara on Shabbat, I didn't bring in the source, but I'll quote it. He says, "V'kol shekain sheyesh od benatayim." if it begins with Divrei Torah, it ends with Divrei Torah, then for sure in the middle of Divrei Torah. And Divrei Torah are Divrei Torah kemashmat, literally Divrei Torah. There's quoting from the Torah. They're saying it doesn't, you might think that it doesn't fit with the overall theme when they were considering excluding it from Tanakh, but ultimately it's connected with the rest of Tanakh. It's not this is like maybe if you can think of like on a TV show, this might be a special episode, but it belongs. It's not, you're not talking about some other, series entirely. So I think that this, if I had any, chidushim in the book, I think this is one of them, that looking at the historical context of Kohelet, or Shlomo, etc., it provides it with more meaning than an isolated philosophical text. There are many, many commentaries on Kohelet. I've read a lot of them, and there's even more that are coming out now. It doesn't stop. As Kohelet himself said, you make a lot of books. There's never end to writing books. But the vast majority of them, we're looking at it as a existential, eternal, philosophical text that could have been written by any philosopher. Maybe it's relevant now, maybe it's relevant then, but it was a philosophical text that was minutak, was isolated from the rest of Tanakh. And I think it is a book about Adam. They're saying Adam, because by the way, the Kohelet, it's interesting. Someone did a textual analysis. The word Adam appears more frequently in Kohelet and in the first 4 parakim of Bereshit than anywhere else in the Tanakh. Kohelet uses Ish very little, but uses Adam a lot. Again, there's a significant connection there. So for those who want to say that Kohelet is speaking to every human, to all of humanity, it's true. There is messages that are eternal. But one of the chidushim of the Tanakh itself is that the story of humanity is one of progress. It's one of advancement. It's not disconnected from history. It's not an isolated text. It starts with Adam, continues to Shlomo, and eventually gets to us. That's history. We don't believe in, the creation, the world's always existed. We don't believe that humanity's always been the same. And so there will be a text that applies only then. And so by having this historical context, even if it's in a hinted kind of way, we can understand the belonging in Tanakh because we can see the development. Look what happened to Adam. Look what happened to Shlomo. And by extension, look what happened to many other events in Tanakh. In the book, I talk about other characters. I talk about, for example, the story of the spies. There's a lot of parallels between the story of the spies and the story of Adam and Shlomo. They're also searching for knowledge. They also took fruit. They're also punished with expulsion. Because we're talking about a retzef. We're talking about a spectrum. And that is by the brilliant way that Kohelet was written, we can understand that. It might take a little bit of looking a little more carefully, but you can get there by paying attention to some of these connections. So we've talked about why the book is confusing, sometimes contradictory, with no obvious plot, and sometimes and therefore appearing tedious. The plot would keep us engaged, and why it doesn't seem to belong in Tanakh. But the last question is, what about how depressing it is? I think, after reading it, that it's actually not quite so depressing. I think it actually is a message of hope. We never read of Adam doing tshuva or Shlomo doing tshuva. But I think that Kohelet is that tshuva. As I mentioned, I found other connections to the story of the spies and other biblical texts. The spies, by the way, also intertextuality. Kohelet uses one of these rare but very, very loaded Hebrew words, latur. It doesn't appear very much in the Tanakh, but whenever you find it, it means something. That's not a word thrown around loosely. It's used in the story of the spies and in Kohelet, but it's also used in the mitzvah of tzitzit, in the commandment of tzitzit. Lo tatur acharei lovchem. It kind of bookends this. The beginning of the story of the spies begin with latur, and later in Parshat Shlach, at the end of Parshat Shlach, it also uses latur to connect. That might be when you can have intertextuality in the same book, in the same passage. That's an example of intertextuality. Many of you might have noticed that when you're reading Parshat Shlach. But that led me to the conclusion that many of the mitzvot are also connected to the themes of Kohelet, and they come to teach us how to avoid the failings of Adam and then later Shlomo. So tzitzit is there, and I have a whole interesting discussion about tzitzit. One of the one of my teachers, Shimon Heksher, if anyone knows Shimon Heksher here from Kibbutz Yavne, He quoted the Ibn Ezra, had a very interesting idea about tzitzit, about how it's not the normal way of understanding tzitzit, about how it actually isn't even necessarily the fringes you attach to the garment, but it's fringes that are kind of it's an unfinished garment, and that leads us to understand certain things. And it was actually here in this shul that I came to understand that text. It didn't in my notes, but I have to mention it. I was in shul, and I stepped out for a minute, and my belt broke. My pants stayed up, my belt broke, and I was like, oh, now I get it. I feel, because the tzitzit is you're supposed to feel that the clothes don't belong to you. You're not a full person. And later it talks about kriya, and you can talk about the stories of Shaul and many other stories that talk about kriya. But like I was understanding, oh right, I don't feel so complete without this belt that's working. So it was in these very halls, that I came to understanding of the mitzvah of tzitzit as the Ibn Ezra explains it. I mentioned others. I talk about the laws relating to the Mishkan, to the sanctuary. The Mishkan, like Garden of Eden, was a place for God and man to meet. And they're indeed another example of intertextuality. I bring many in the book. The passage describing the creation of the world in the Garden of Eden in Bereshit, and the construction and dedication of the Mishkan in Shemot and Vayikra, again, parallel after parallel after parallel. These are clearly meant to pick up these signs when we're reading Bereshit and reading Vayikra and Shemot. One obvious example that many of you might have caught, or if you're not, you'll hopefully remember it this year when we read Bereshit, is the Churuvim that were at both. They were in both the Mishkan and they were in Gan Eden. But there are many more. And we're speaking right after Yom Kippur. In the book, I talk about how the Yom Kippur service in the Mishkan is one time of the year when, after the sins are forgiven, a return to Gan Eden is simulated. For that one precious moment, man and God are close together again. And that's why I called it a map to Eden, because I think the Kohelet is providing us, readers, a way to avoid those failings of Adam and Shlomo and to return to Gan Eden. There are a number of attempts to return to Gan Eden and Tanakh, and it seems every time we try, it seems to fail. You can look at the story of Noach, and you can look at the story of Nadav and Avihu, and you can look at the story of the spies, and you can look at the Shlomo even failed, even though he finally built what should have been Gan Eden, and it never worked. But we have the opportunity to learn those lessons through the mitzvot, through the lessons of Kohelet. And at the very end of the book, and I quote here in source 7, Sof davar kol nishmat, elim yirav, et mitzvotav yishamor, ki zeh kol adam. So, zeh kol adam, Adam here, I think both refers to humans and to Adam HaRishon. Right? That was the purpose of the mitzvah that he didn't keep. And there's a lot to unpack in this verse. It's a very difficult verse, but it's a very, very loaded verse. But in the end, it's saying something I think really, really important. It's saying that you, Adam, Shlomo, or any of us, have an opportunity for a close relationship with God. And we need to do everything we can to preserve it. Adam had one mitzvah. He had not to eat that one fruit. He didn't have to eat that fruit. He had the whole garden he could eat from. He had that one fruit, and he just had to have it. And he blew it. And Shlomo certainly didn't need to build up his kingdom to the point that these foreign entanglements would lead him astray. What could have been worth more to him than a healthy relationship with his creator, with God, who had this special thing from when he was young, who was like his, God gave him his name, that he loved him so much, and he blew that for the sake of one more wife, for some gold, for some horses, for the, an alliance with Paro. That was worth it to lose the connection you have with God. And throughout our lives, we all look back at choices we have with some regret. Not us here, but certainly you can imagine a scenario with, maybe someone betrayed a spouse or something, where they had a loving relationship with a spouse and they lost it, and then what kind of regret for a fleeting moment? That was worth it? No, they later regret it for the rest of their lives because they had something very special, and that's the mitzvot. The mitzvot here it's not saying mitzvot in the sense of the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, it is saying that, but it's not saying that because we wanted to keep the mitzvot because of some, it's not saying in a mystical sense of what it's going to affect the world if we do these mitzvot, and it's also not saying in a rational sense of like, oh, we're going to improve ourselves or we're going to improve our society by doing mitzvot. No, it's saying you have this loyalty in any relationship. There's expectation in the relationship, and whatever the reason is, it doesn't even matter. Sometimes we understand the reasons in the relationship, and sometimes we don't. But when it's violated, it can't always be repaired. So I think Kohelet is Shlomo's attempt to have readers learn from those mistakes. And in that sense, the book isn't depressing at all. It shows a path of hope, a way back to Gan Eden. That's encouraging. That's even Shlomo, who, Chazal. I have to say something that, someone asked me recently, did you get any pushback for being so critical of Shlomo in the book? So I said, first of all, I love pushback because that meant people read the book. I want pushback as much. Any of you want to push back, I'm happy to hear. Pitchforks and torches. But I said, I picked a relatively easy target, right? Because Chazal, not only were they willing to potentially exclude Kohelet from the Tanakh, they debated whether Shlomo was worthy of Olam Haba at all. That's kind of crazy. But I figured, anything I say, if they were debating this, there are other figures we have to be more careful about. But with Shlomo, if they could say about that, and with Shlomo, who they talk about, they expand on what it says in the Tanakh. They not only say that he was punished, but he was, exiled from his throne. He was thrown out of the kingdom. He might not have got Olam Haba. All these terrible things. But if Shlomo, after all that, can write a book which is telling us how to avoid his mistakes, then that's an amazing gift that we have. And so in that sense, I don't find it depressing at all. I admit that there's a lot of new ideas in my book. Some of these things are not entirely new. I found hints to them in Midrashim or traditional commentaries, and there's many footnotes in the book, and you can continue to expand on that if you'd like. But there were times that I present ideas that don't have direct precedent. One example of that is the name of Hevel. Why did Adam name his son Hevel? It seems kind of strange. And there were explanations about this. Again, Hevel, by the way, while it's traditionally translated as futility or vanity, it literally means breath. Hevel piv. So my understanding of this, my idea of how this came to be, according to Chazal, and I think there's maybe a degree of pshat there as well, when it talks about the birth of Cain and Hevel, it mentions one pregnancy, but two births. So Chazal say that Cain and Hevel were twins. There's certainly narrative parallels to that with Esav and Yaakov later on, the tension between them and so on. This will apply even if it wasn't twins, but it's even stronger if they are twins. I imagine a scenario where Chava gives birth to Cain, healthy baby, but as we know, certainly now, certainly then, birth of twins was very difficult. We see it with Tamar later on. So maybe the next baby was born. They didn't know if he was going to survive. What's going to happen? He comes out, he's born, but is he going to live? The second baby. And then he breathes. And so, Hevel, breath. It's a positive name. But breath is transitory, and it doesn't last. And Hevel didn't last. So it wasn't that his name meant that he was going to be destined for doom, but it did reflect the temporary nature of his life, and something we have to appreciate. So I think that was my idea of the name of Hevel. By the way, I wrote this and then didn't know it was going to resonate. Speaking to someone who said that they had twins, and it was literally what they felt when the second baby was born. They actually said, "Yeah, I just didn't know if the baby was going to breathe." And when they felt their breath, they knew it was okay. And I felt chills go up my spine when I heard that story. Anyway, that was an example of something. There's other, you can call it creative ideas, but I have to say that when I wrote the book, I didn't actually feel in many ways that I was writing it. When I sat there at my brother-in-law's house and I was looking at these things, I wasn't planning on writing a book. I thought maybe it'll be a Dvar Torah or Shir somewhere, maybe an article, but I didn't think I was writing a book. What I felt was that I was pulling away the layers to something that was already there. That's somewhat new, but it also is not my own invention. It was just something I kind of felt that resonated with me. Only later, I didn't include the book. If I had paid attention, I would have included it. Did I find Rashi's comment on Kohelet, Perek Aleph Pasuk Tet. He says, Mashaya Hushiyah, in source 8. B'chol mashu lamed b'devar shu chalifei hashemesh ein bo chidush. Kohelet talks a lot about the natural world. And he says there's nothing new in the natural world. The sun is the same, and the rivers are the same, and there's nothing new. The world, the natural world we have is the same as always been. Lo yireh ela mashayakva. You're not going to see anything new. You're not going to find any new chidushim in the world of nature. Shenivra b'shesh yemei Bereshit. Aval hogeh b'Torah, but someone who studies Torah, motzeh ba tamid chidushei ta'amim. You're always going to find something new. So that gave me the encouragement and the support to continue with to finding those new insights. To feel like I was willing to take a little extra step to be able to fill in the gaps of the book, the things that made sense to me. I hope that those ideas resonate with you. As I said, if not, I'm happy to hear about them as well. Time for any questions?
You said you had a theory about why it was called Kohelet, but...
Okay, so I'll mention a little bit why it's called Kohelet. I don't want to give away the book, but if you're going to get the book anyway, if you all promise to get the book, then I have no problem giving away the end. I talk a lot in the book about the laws of the king. This is, again, why I think it's really important for the historical context. Without the historical context, it becomes very, very difficult. But the Kohelet is connected to Shlomo, and Shlomo violating those laws of the king. The prohibitions of amassing gold and wives and horses and so on. What was read at Hakel? According to the Mishnah, what was read at Hakel? Anyone know? Parshat HaMelech. The Parshat HaMelech was read at Hakel. That was what was supposed to be read. There's a story in the Mishnah, which is in the book I mentioned, also kind of sent chills up my spine when I first read it. I don't have a quote here, so if anyone can correct me if I'm not quoting it perfectly, but there's a story of the king Yanai, who was a descendant of converts. And he got to the point in Parshat HaMelech when he read, and they said that the king needs to be a native-born Jew. And he started to cry, and the people consoled him and said, it's okay, you'll be okay. So, I'm imagining, what would Shlomo have felt? Yanai was a good king. He just happened to be from foreign stock. Shlomo had violated the very essence of what it means to be a king. So, my idea is that if that bothered Yanai so much, it's hard to imagine that Shlomo would have been able to read it as it was. And so I have to think that he probably just never read that parsha. He didn't do a hakel of that nature, or maybe he didn't do it at least when he had violated those laws. Maybe the earliest kingdom, but certainly did it later on. And so this was his hakel. This was his repairing that parshat HaMelech that he never read before. And so Kohelet is hakel for him. He became Kohelet because he wanted to do the hakel that he didn't succeed in doing those times. Had he listened to hakel, had he listened to Parshat HaMelech, then he wouldn't have ended up in the place where he had to write Kohelet. So I think Kohelet is talking about hakel. And by the way, there's also reference in the text to what's mentioned in hakel that are parallel to laws of the king. That's discussed more in the book. So I think that's ultimately why. Different answers are given. That was the one that resonated with me. Again, there's always new things when you're learning Torah. Yes?
Just didn't come up in the conversation. I don't know if it comes up in the book, but the connection of Kohelet, reading Kohelet on Sukkot. If you're linking everything back to the first man in your creation, and that's, so is it just the new year? Is it the bringing of the earth? Is it bringing of, you know what I'm
yes,
saying?
I actually was thought that this question would be answered, so I actually brought source 9 as an example. I'll try to go through it quickly. If you look at the laws of the king, there are very strong parallels in Parshat Ekev in source 9. But in source 9, it's not talking to the king, it's talking to the people in general. It says, Hishamer lacha pen tishkach et Hashem Elokecha. Why? What's going to cause you to forget God? Pen tochal v'savata ubatim tovim tivne v'yeshavta uberkarcha b'tzoncha yerbun v'kesef v'zahav yerbelecha v'kol asher lecha yerbeh. It mentions 3 times the root l'rabot. which also the 3 times it appears in Parshat HaMelech. This text is very similar, and you can go more in depth in the book, in the appendix of the book, to the Parshat HaMelech, but it applies to all of us. The one thing that doesn't, the kings don't have a danger, at least according to the Parshat HaMelech, is ubatim tovim tivneh. You're going to build these nice houses. The king does not have a prohibition against building. If anything, the kings were the ones to build. It's very interesting. If you look at the entire Tanakh, from the beginning until you don't see, with one curious exception, which I mentioned in a footnote there, we'll go into it, there's no mention of anyone building a house until you get to David and Shlomo. They're the first people who actually use the verb banabai. There's mitzvot that you've been about, but there's no example of a person actually at his houses. But there's no time you see an example of actually someone building a house until David and Shlomo. But that building of a house had the same dangers that this section is talking about.
Wasn't it bracha for shofar pua?
But it doesn't mention it it doesn't mention it, it's a Vasulem Batim, it doesn't say Benulem Batim, right? It doesn't mention Benulem Batim. There's a very, the pasuk where David comes, it says that he wants to build the house. I'm sure I read it before, but I never paid that much attention until I was studying for this book. It says something that I don't think resonates with a lot of us. It doesn't connect in how we generally think about the Beit HaMikdash today. We have, we sing songs about Beit HaMikdash and we want to build Beit HaMikdash. And what is God's response to David's request to build the Mikdash? What does he say? He says, what? I never asked you to build a house. Where am I happy? In a tent. In a sukkah. I'm happy. The building of the house is for you. It's not for me. It's very, it echoes the same request for the people to have a king in the first place. Also, you want a king? Okay, God says, God's like a parent. I assume most of us here have children. We know that part of being a parent is you have to let the kids do their own things. You have to let them make mistakes. And even if you hope to do the right choice, but God wasn't going to stop them. Whether it was a good thing not to have a king, debatable. Whether it was a good thing to have a Beit HaMikdash, or whether it was better to stay in a Mishkan and oil, debatable. But there was a risk to it. The risk is you feel confident in a house in a way that you do not feel confident in an oil, in a way that you do not feel confident in a tent. The Mishkan did not provide the people who were later in the Beit HaMikdash in Yirmiyahu's time saying Heichal Hashem, Heichal Hashem, Heichal Hashem, because they felt that it was a fortress, the Beit HaMikdash. And people who live in houses feel that those are fortresses. And that's exactly why we need to go into the Sukkah, to realize that the bounty that we have, we're miniature kings. We don't have all the rules. But we have certain things. You're gonna have all these benefits. You're going to have affluence. You're going to have abundance. Hold on. Step out. Go into the sukkah. Go into this tent. Go into this temporary area. And you're going to remember, I'm actually dependent on God. This is not all mine. I'm not going to feel that this confidence. If you, by the way, there's one parak and Tehillim, or two parakim and Tehillim that are associated with Shlomo. And one of them, both of them I discussed in the book, but one of them says that if God didn't build the house, then who built it? Shlomo, of all people, say that. But Shlomo built the house. He built his own house. He built the Beit HaMikdash. So I think that's the lesson of Sukkot. Historically, I don't know why Kohelet was chosen to be read in Sukkot. There's a lot of debate about that. It's fascinating reading. Again, historical stuff absolutely fascinates me. But what I can say with confidence is that if you asked me what book should be read in Sukkot, I would have picked Kohelet. Whether that was the reason initially, I don't know, but that definitely seems to fit. I can't think of a better book than Kohelet to read in Sukkot. Any other questions? Yes.
In all of your study, did you find anything about why Kohelet is far and away the longest of the Megillot, and why is it 12 chapters? Anything about that?
The chapter breaks, I assume, was not a Jewish division. The length, it's a good question. I don't know. Again, the best I would say is because it's just this feeling. You're supposed to feel confused. You're supposed to feel uncomfortable when you're reading Kohelet because you're reading the sayings of someone who isn't comfortable themselves and looking back on the life with difficulty. If it was a quick jaunt, then maybe you wouldn't feel that way. And if we were supposed to be a little, sitting in our chairs and moving around, and when this could be over, and the way that we'd feel if we were sitting across from someone who was having a very difficult time and we had to try to console them, we didn't know what to say. I never thought about the question before, but I think that's probably part of it.
It's like a Shiva code. It's like you said that there's things that are compared to Shiva. And when there is a Shiva, especially when it's elderly, person who died and not an assault but a sadness. Then there is also that the pondering of stories of different phases and backstories and again a story because something else came in.
It definitely has a feeling of a shiva in that sense. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming. For anyone who's interested, books are available for sale in the lobby, and I'm happy to sign quickly. I apologize, by the way, one final thing I want to say. I wrote this book over the course of the last 6 years. Sadly, my father, who was not, he passed away during the time I was writing this, and my father was a prolific writer of books. He wrote over 20 books, but he was he had a lot of difficulty in his youth. He was in the hospital for all of first grade. For all of first grade. He never learned to write, and yet he ended up becoming a writer. So his handwriting was atrocious. So if I do sign your book, and you have difficulty deciphering, it's still better than my father's, and I think my father's looking back and saying, okay, it's not so bad. So, you know.
So when you go back here to buy a book, please also check out, we have flyers hanging, the Women's Bait and Trash. We're hosting sukkah events throughout Sukkot at different people's homes in different neighborhoods in Efrat. So go find your neighborhood, and the gush, right, and the Beit Daniel. So find your neighborhood or go to a new neighborhood. Maybe you'll meet other people, right, new people. And we encourage you to at least go to one
you're
of
right.
the events. Thank you, David. That was really
King Agrippa's, not King Yanai. Thank you, Danny. That's actually really important. Yes, let me just find a table or something.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much, Poppy. Oh, I'm going to do some. Not at all. No repeats. No repeats. But I'm looking good.